Hello, everybody, and welcome to the November edition of the EAU's Global Outlook video. I'm Robert Wood, Principal Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean, specializing on Brazil. And today I'm joined by Andrew Viteritti, Principal Economist for Latin America, focusing on Mexico. And Andrew is based in our Washington, D.C. offices. We're going to be discussing the outlook for Mexico under its new government, and also the implications of the close US election. To be clear, we are recording this before the vote on November the 5th, and currently we see the race as a coin toss between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. But let's turn to Mexico. So, Andrew, let's turn first to politics in Mexico. The new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has just taken office for a 6-year term. She's the successor of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's known as AMLO in Mexican circles. He left office with high popularity. And now her left-leaning party, Morena, has supermajorities in the legislature. But what political challenges does Ms. Sheinbaum face, and how do you think these will play out?
Sure, Rob. So Sheinbaum starts her term in a favorable position. She won the presidential election by a landslide. She has the support of the previous president, AMLO, as you mentioned, who remains very popular. And her party, Morena, holds commanding majorities in the new Congress that took office in September, effectively super majorities. That being said, she still faces some pretty substantial political constraints, particularly when it comes to implementing her policy agenda, which she has signaled and we believe will be more pragmatic and less populist than the agenda that AMLO had pushed during his own presidency. Now, the first of those constraints is actually Congress. So many of those seats that comprise those supermajorities that I mentioned before, many of those are held by Morena hardliners who remain very loyal to AMLO and certainly would resist any big shift away from his previous policy agenda that Sheinbaum might pursue. The other constraint is the potential for a presidential recall referendum. This is something that AMLO had introduced during his own presidency and could very well see Sheinbaum ousted halfway during her term. And then the final constraint is actually AMLO himself. So he has signaled that he would leave political life after having exited office, and he also has signaled that he endorses Sheinbaum taking full ownership over her presidency. That being said, it seems very likely that he's going to remain very influential in Morena, not least because his son has recently been appointed to a leadership position within the party. Now, what does this mean for Sheinbaum? Well, essentially, it means that she has very limited room to maneuver. Our baseline assumption is that she's going to continue to try to strike this balance between the more orthodox elements of her policy agenda and the more radical ideological leanings of Morena, but risks, or rather the odds are stacking up against her, and there is a high risk that she's not going to manage to strike this balance successfully.
Okay, let's turn now to Mexico's key relations with the US. And so I think investors want to know, what the impact would be of either a Trump or Harris presidency on bilateral relations. Of course, the free trade agreement, the USMCA, is coming up for another renewal in 2026. But presumably, if Trump wins the presidency, there could be some changes in the shorter term around immigration and trade. And how do you think Sheinbaum would handle a Trump presidency?
Sure. So really good questions, Rob. And it goes without question that, and there's no doubt that the result of the US presidential election would be highly consequential for Mexico's outlook. And that really speaks to the big differences that we see in the policy agendas of the two main candidates in the US presidential election. So Kamala Harris, who represents the Democrats, and Donald Trump, who represents the Republicans. And I'm particularly speaking about differences that we see in the areas of trade, immigration, and border security, all of which are very important for Mexico and the bilateral relationship. Now, if Harris were to win, we would expect her administration to present a more benign outlook for Mexico. And that has to do with her more collaborative approach towards migration management, her support of nearshoring, and also our assumption that the USMCA renewal that you had mentioned that will take place in 2026 would be relatively smooth. If Trump were to win, our outlook for Mexico and also the bilateral relationship with the US is much more pessimistic. And that's because of his highly antagonistic approach to issues like bilateral relations, trade, nearshoring, and migration management. He also has signaled that he would prefer to fully renegotiate USMCA, which would provide for, it would create a much more bumpy process. Although I should note that we don't expect that the US would ever exit the USMCA, regardless of how bad those discussions were to get. In terms of what this means for Sheinbaum, particularly the prospect of a Trump presidency and how she would deal with him, well, it would be a very challenging relationship for her. And we would expect that dealing with the US and dealing with a Trump administration would be more difficult than what her predecessor AMLO had to deal with, given that he was able to strike a pretty decent rapport with Trump, one that we don't expect to replicate or be replicated under Sheinbaum. If Harris were to win, we would expect that that relationship would be more smooth between Mexico and the U.S. in terms of the executives and their relationship with one another. Part of that has to do with just there being more common ground between Sheinbaum and Harris. If Harris were to win, both of them would be their country's first female presidents. They both would come from leftist parties. But I should also note that even if Harris were to win, we still would expect some elements of tension and friction in the bilateral relationship. And that would be over issues like Mexico's protectionism, including in the energy sector, over a set of controversial constitutional reforms that AMLO had pushed and that Sheinbaum has signaled she's going to continue pushing forward, and also over increasing pressure that we've seen from the US placed on Mexico regarding restrictions on Chinese investment into Mexico. And actually, that's something that we would expect to continue regardless of who was to win the presidential election here in the States in November.
Okay, you've touched on a few economic policy areas, but I don't know if you can just expand a little bit and try and highlight what the differences you see in terms of Sheinbaum's likely economic policies compared to AMLO's. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, so I can start out with the similarities. So we would expect that Sheinbaum would maintain AMLO's push for fiscal austerity, although she will have to reconcile that with some pretty substantial spending plans that she's outlined. We also would expect her to maintain the state's strong role in the economy, particularly in the energy sector. And we would also expect her, as I alluded to before, to continue pushing AMLO's controversial constitutional reforms. Those are the similarities. There are some important points of difference. One of those has to do with Sheinbaum's already pretty explicit encouragement of private and foreign investment. She also has signaled that she prioritizes the green transition, and she also has signaled an interest in developing infrastructure more on competitiveness rather than on social grounds, all of which is very different from what AMLO did. She also has signaled an interest in watering down some of the more radical elements of those constitutional reforms that AMLO had pushed and that she's continuing to push through Mexico's Congress. And that would also be a potential important area of distinction. In terms of what this means for investors and for Mexico's business climate, really a lot is going to come down to Sheinbaum's relationship with the new Mexican Congress and also the outcome of the US presidential election in November.
okay. And in terms of economic performance, so even though we've had a strong US economy this year, Mexico's economy has been slowing, hasn't it? What's the outlook over the medium term, the next year and over the next couple of years?
Sure, Rob. So Mexico has definitely entered into a period of slower economic growth, and that's something that we would expect to continue into 2025. So we've penciled in growth coming in at 1.4% as an estimate for 2024, so for this year. And that marks a pretty substantial climb down from the growth that we saw in 2023 when growth came in for Mexico at 3.2%. And we are expecting that things are going to bottom out in 2025 with growth coming in at 1.2% for Mexico, and then for things to gradually improve thereafter, with Mexico experiencing a little bit firmer growth over the rest of the outlook period, so through 2029. And that would be in coordination with a recovery that we're expecting in the US's own economy. Something that I should note is that one factor that will prevent growth from slowing down even further than we're expecting is strong or a continuation of strong trade and investment linkages between the US and Mexico. That's something that we would expect to happen regardless of who wins the presidential election in November. I should note also that if Harris were to win instead of Trump, we would expect that Mexico's growth outlook would be slightly more positive compared to what it would be if Trump were to win instead.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Mexico sort of going through a bit of a soft patch over the medium term, in a bit of a reversal. Here, looking at the two biggest economies in Latin America, we have Brazil growing around 2%, a little bit above 2% over the medium term. And before the pandemic, of course, Mexico was growing faster than Brazil. And now we have a reversal of that. So that's quite an interesting trend. Okay, to conclude, Andrew, what's next? What should investors in Mexico be looking out for over the coming 3 to 6 months?
Sure, Rob. So there are three things that we would recommend investors and also our clients keeping an eye on in the next couple of months, especially to get a firmer read on what Sheinbaum's presidency is going to look like and what it means for Mexico's outlook. The first of those is Sheinbaum's budget proposal to Congress. That will take place in November, and it will give us a better steer as to how she plans to balance her spending priorities, which she's outlined, against some pretty substantial fiscal constraints that she inherited from AMLO's presidency. The second thing to keep an eye out on is the constitutional reform process that I had been mentioning before. As I had said, Sheinbaum has signaled that she potentially will water these reforms down. These reforms have been very controversial. They faced opposition from the business community. They've also faced opposition from the US and Canadian governments. Only time will tell, though, whether Sheinbaum actually intends to water these down, and more importantly, whether she actually succeeds in doing so. And the final thing to keep an eye out on, and this probably won't be a surprise, is the results of the US presidential election, since that will play a key role in dictating the bilateral relationship between the two countries, Mexico's nearshoring potential, and also Mexico's economic outlook.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Well, let's wrap that up. And as you mentioned, we are all focusing on the US presidential elections. And I invite you all to tune into the next month's edition of the EIU's Global Outlook video when we should know who has won the elections. Thank you.